Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s. I'm Matt Williamson. Today we're going to be doing a review of The Complete Beatles, this documentary that came out in 1982. Now, unfortunately, this documentary, which I think is one of the best tellings of the Beatles story, has been largely forgotten, and that due to the anthology project that came the decade following, and that became the documentary on the Beatles. It was done by the Beatles, was authorized, and this one kind of fell by the wayside. But what makes this so good is that it was done by a writer who totally understood the Beatles story and their overarching contribution to music, as well as their contribution to Western civilization. So that makes this story a great perspective, and in under 2 hours, it's done very efficiently. I remember when this came out, and I didn't see it right away, but it was released on PBS as a documentary here in the United States anyway. And at only 12 years after the breakup of the Beatles, that seems so close to me now. But at the time, it seemed like a super long time in between the breakup and when this was released. So just to put it in further perspective, it was only 18 years after they were on the Sullivan Show before they broke wide open in the United States. So 18 years. And already, this is probably the first time the Beatles story was put succinctly into a very proper contextual context. Contextual context? Contextual story. Let's put it that way. How about that? And the thing that made it, I think, more poignant is it was released only 18 months after John Lennon was shot. So there's a gloominess to it because we know how the story ends. I think with Lennon being assassinated in '80, that put to rest any reunions of the Beatles, really. That was truly the end of the band, and everybody knew it. And that gloominess still pervaded 18 months later when this was released. And we see that gloominess kind of start the story, which is post-war Britain in the Beatles' pre-fame years.
Liverpool, 200 miles to the northwest of London. Nothing much ever came from Liverpool, but soccer teams and British comedians. The city droned on wearily in post-war Britain, a nation nostalgic for its triumphant past, threadbare and tired in its present. For a boy growing up in Liverpool, the future was no brighter than that which his father had faced, or his father's father. In 1956, in fact, there was little to suggest that out of this provincial seaport would come 4 young men and a musical revolution that would captivate and change the world.
Ringo, George, John.
That's Malcolm McDowell doing the narration, and McDowell typically gets the attention when anytime this is talked about, and his very fine narration. But really, the person that deserves the credit is David Silver. He's the writer, and this is written. It's very tight, and there's no time wasted, and the direction is by Patrick Montgomery. So one of the things that makes this so good, in addition to the great story, are the great interviews. So there are no principal interviews with the Beatles or the ex-Beatles at the time this was put together. There's some archival stuff, but the new interviews are largely people that were close to them. And the most important interviews, I think, of this were George Martin. He gives some just outstanding, some of the best interviews ever in the history of the band's who's ever interviewing them or any kind of documentation. This, I thought, was some of his finest interviews here, and they capture quite a lot of George Martin. In addition to Martin, we have the Beatles' early manager, Alan Williams, who also adds some very good information. We've got Cavern Club owner, or Cavern Club DJ Bob Wooler, music writer Bill Harry. We have musicians Jerry Marsden, Billy J. Kramer, Marianne Faithfull, Billy Preston, Lenny Kaye, and Tony Sheridan. All were there and all offer very good tidbits that support the story and really help people understand how new and fresh the Beatles were, and how different they were. I think that's the main takeaway from some of these interviews that are talking about the early career. And I think that's really central to the story. I think that gets lost a lot in today's world, and younger people don't understand how different those Beatles were coming in out of nowhere. We just take for granted that they've been here so long. I think that's part of the story that gets lost. Well, this documentary, it totally understands that, and I think that's a big part of the storytelling here. Now, the other thing that's great about this, they use a lot of original music. I appreciate the video production of this because they use some bootleg music in the background underneath as a music bed. They've got foghorns. They've got all different things that are setting the tone when they're talking about old Liverpool. And all that is just very professionally done and makes it just puts you there, really. The other thing I love a lot is the promo films and the live performances. Now, when I saw this, I actually recorded this off of television. And I had never seen any of this. I think I may have seen A Hard Day's Night by this time, but that's really all I had seen on the Beatles. So all that live footage of them and some of the promo films I thought were just incredible for me to see. And I'd seen those for the first time. Having tape recorded this, I watched this dozens of times and I had it almost memorized. And so this documentary had everything a young Beatle fan could want. And I had recorded it off of, must have been PBS. And the version that I had on tape was shorter than the 2-hour version that was here. And it was maybe an hour 45 minutes, hour 40, I don't remember because I don't have that tape anymore. But I thought that it's told very well. And one of the things that I liked about it and went back to it some years later is that it didn't have the bias a lot of the other contemporary stories had. For example, some of the biographies written during the time, Philip Norman's Shout, The Lives of John Lennon by Albert Goldman, and Lennon by Ray Coleman. All of these were heavily biased and really started to muddy the waters and create, they were divisive, not just to actual history, but it became divisive among Beatle fans. And this didn't have any of that. It's told very balanced, and there isn't a ton of time to go into the reasons that they broke up, but those reasons are here. It's whitewashed in the anthology. I'll talk about that on another occasion, but the anthology was fraught with compromise. And the final version of that on DVD, anyway, was 10 hours of material. And this really tells more, I think, in a fifth of that than the anthology does. Now, the anthology is beautiful to watch. There's a lot of, it's filled with tons of performances, way more than this. So there's a lot of that in there too, which is great. But just for pure storytelling, I think that this gets the nod over the anthology. And because of the bias, as I said, the anthology was fraught with compromise because everybody kind of brought in some of their people, and they had to compromise on who that was going to be. Paul had his people, George had his people, Ringo had his people. So, and then Yoko had her people. So that made things a little bit difficult in telling that story because hands were tied. Now, one of the beautiful things of not having your hands tied is that you typically have very good quality storytelling from unauthorized people doing it. This is not authorized. And the reason why that can be a good thing, although I think some people find that if it's unauthorized, that they associate that with falsehood or not approved by the people that are being talked about. Well, the people that approve it being talked about are the ones that usually censor and keep things from going out there. That even happened in the Hunter Davies book that was written, the official story of the Beatles that came out in 1968. I think that and the anthology are really the only two official things that have come out of the Beatles, of their history. Everything else has technically been unofficial. So you can see how it runs the gamut. But in this case, I think this tells a very good story. Now, one of the things that you hear about this is that when the Beatles decided to do the anthology, which came out in 1995, it took a number of years. They were working on it for a number of years before it was released. And the story goes is that the Beatles, and particularly Paul McCartney, bought the rights to this film so as not to compete with the anthology as they were producing it and preparing for its release. Now, I don't know how true that is because it's almost like the Beatles were they knew how good this was. That's why it disappeared. That's why they bought it. If it was some unreliable story that wasn't good, they just would have left it alone. It would have stood on its own for what it was. Well, they knew, I think, damn well that this was a really good story, and I don't think they wanted it upstaging any of their work that they were doing. So that's why they acquired it. Now, there was stories of this being unreleased, unavailable for the years leading up to the anthology, but this particular copy on Laserdisc, this was released in 1994. So I know that this was available for purchase and rent all the way up through 1994. I don't know if there was an agreement, maybe in 1995, this was stopped being produced because the anthology came out in November of 95. Maybe that was the cutoff point, I don't know. But this was available for a good long time. And it was available on VHS tape, beta, Laserdisc, and on CED, or capacitance electronic disc, which was an analog video disc, which I don't really remember, but those were around at the time. Now, since the Beatles own this, obviously I think they just pretend that it doesn't exist. But I think this should have a re-release. If they actually want to reel in some younger fans, I think this is the best way to do it. In this era where we can't even watch long format videos much, we have to have shorts. Well, the way the Beatles have been doing biographies of late, including some of the unauthorized stuff like Mark Lewison, these are expansive works that are not for the casual fan. Even the Get Back thing, that was 7 hours and 46 minutes. And you get the anthology, which in its full length is 10 hours. I think in the original release it was probably 6.5 hours or something. I can't quite remember. But that's also long. I think that if you wanted to appeal to younger people, this would be the way to do it. And I think what you could do, if the Beatles would re-release this, or if they thought about it, the way you'd enhance it is you'd upgrade all of the video in here. Because the video in here was not from primary sources. And all of that we know is there's much better available sources now. And that could be inserted into this. And you could probably even edit maybe a little bit out of this, but under 2 hours, you'd have a great Beatle history. You wouldn't have to bother with long biographies if these young people they have the attention span of a gnat, they can't handle that. This might be something for them. And although the Beatles will, I'm sure, never do it, I think this has so much merit, and I think that it's an essential part of the historical record, if only for making it accessible and the perfect starting point for anyone who wants to know the story of the Beatles. So that is my review on the Compleat Beatles. It's available to watch on YouTube. Typically, some of the music might be muted, but you can find it if you have a Laserdisc player. I guess most people don't. I actually bought a Laserdisc player about 15 years ago because I was picking up Laserdiscs really cheap for 99 cents. And I just like the album size version, so I'm kind of crazy for that format size. So anyway, that's where you may be able to see it if you want to check it on YouTube. So that is my quick review on the Compleat Beatles. And if you want to support this channel in a bigger way, there's a few ways you can do that. I've got my Patreon subscription. I've got a tip jar below for a one-time donation. I always appreciate when you watch the ads. That's how us YouTubers really make money, is sitting through a couple ads that are directed to you anyway. That is a help. And then the free way, of course, is liking and sharing and subscribing. So I'll take any of those if you can. Any of your support is always welcome. And I'll be back with more videos here on Pop Goes the 60s.
Got no kick against modern jazz.